The lights we share. The snow fell softly outside, blanketing the neighborhood in a serene hush. Christmas lights twinkled from every house, turning the quiet street into a festive winter wonderland. But inside the warmth of the Henderson home, there was anything but peace. James, a father of two, and a man who prided himself on getting everything just right, had just come home from another long day at work. His coat was still draped over his arm as he walked through the front door, greeted by the glow of the Christmas tree and the sound of the TV murmuring in the background. The house was beautifully decorated, with lights strung across the windows, wreaths hung on every door, and the faint scent of pine and cinnamon filling the air. To an outsider, it looked like the perfect holiday scene. But for James, it wasn't enough. Another late night, his wife Emily called from the kitchen, where she was finishing the dishes from dinner. James nodded absently, his mind already racing through the list of tasks he still had to complete. There were more gifts to wrap, holiday cards to send out, and, most pressing of all, the Christmas lights in the backyard still hadn't been hung. He dropped his briefcase near the door and immediately set to work, barely pausing to say hello. "Hey, Dad," a voice chimed from the kitchen doorway. Lily, his 16-year-old daughter, stood there, watching him with a mix of curiosity and concern. She had grown up helping her father with every holiday tradition, from picking out the perfect tree to stringing lights along the front porch. But lately, it seemed like James was always preoccupied, too busy to notice that their conversations had become fewer and farther between. "Hey, sweetie," James said, barely glancing up from the tangled mess of Christmas lights he was trying to fix. "I've got a few more things to do before bed. Can you grab the extension cord from the garage?" Lily hesitated, watching her father wrestle with the string of lights as if his life depended on it. She could see the stress etched into his face, the furrowed brow, the way his jaw tightened every time he tugged on the knotted wire. It hadn't always been like this. Just a few years ago, they would have been laughing together, tossing lights into the bushes outside and joking about who could untangle them the fastest. But now, all she could feel was a growing distance. "Sure," she said quietly, turning toward the garage. But her steps were slow, her heart heavy. She didn't care about the lights. She cared about him. James barely noticed Lily slip away as he continued his battle with the lights. He was exhausted, overwhelmed by the demands of the holiday season. Work had been relentless, and every night he came home with a mountain of tasks that seemed to grow by the minute. Christmas had always been his favorite time of year, but now it felt like a race to make everything perfect. He wanted the house to look just right for the neighbors, the decorations to be flawless for the family gathering, and the presents to be wrapped with precision. He wanted his kids to have the kind of Christmas they would remember for the rest of their lives. But in the process, something had been lost. Lily returned with the extension cord and handed it to her father, who barely looked up as he muttered a thanks. She watched as he plugged in the lights, frustration building as they flickered unevenly before going dark again. "Why won't this thing work?" James grumbled, yanking at the lights in frustration. Lily stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. She knew her father meant well. He always had. He wanted Christmas to be special, to to make everything perfect for them, but it was clear to her that he was missing the point. She didn't care if the lights were perfect, or if the house looked like something out of a holiday movie. What she cared about was the time they used to spend together, the conversations they used to have while they worked on these little traditions. "Dad," she said softly, trying to catch his attention. "It's okay if the lights aren't perfect." James didn't hear her. He was too focused on untangling the mess in front of him, muttering under his breath about faulty wiring and how nothing ever seemed to go smoothly. His hands fumbled with the string of bulbs, the frustration building as each knot seemed to grow tighter the more he tried to fix it. "Dad," Lily said again, a little louder this time. But still, nothing. Finally, she let out a soft sigh, stepping back from the scene. Her father was so wrapped up in his idea of creating the perfect Christmas that he couldn't see what was right in front of him, that all she wanted was to spend time with him, like they used to. She didn't need the perfect decorations, or the picture-perfect holiday that he seemed so desperate to achieve. All she needed was him. Lily walked back to the kitchen, feeling the weight of the distance between them. The Christmas lights twinkled brightly outside, but inside there was a quiet sadness, an unspoken wish that her father would slow down and realize what really mattered before the holiday passed them by. As James continued his struggle with the decorations, Lily stood at the kitchen counter, watching him through the doorway. She could see the stress in every movement, the way his shoulders tensed, the way his eyes focused only on the task at hand. She could feel the growing divide between them, a divide that seemed to widen with every passing minute. What she missed wasn't the lights or the decorations. She missed her father. After dinner, the house fell into a familiar evening rhythm. The sound of Emily cleaning up in the kitchen could be heard, and the soft glow of the Christmas tree illuminated the living room, where Lily sat curled up on the couch, scrolling absent-mindedly through her phone. Outside, the snow continued to fall gently, adding to the already thick blanket that covered the yard. James, however, couldn't sit still. As soon as dinner was done, he was up, grabbing his coat and boots, muttering something about finishing the lights outside. His movements were rushed, his face tight with concentration. There was still so much to do, and the pressure of getting everything right weighed heavily on him. With a sigh, he stepped out into the cold night, the air biting at his cheeks as he crossed the backyard toward the tangled mess of Christmas lights waiting for him. The house was already well decorated. Lights twinkled from the roofline, wreaths hung on every door, and the front yard glowed with carefully placed ornaments. But the backyard wasn't quite done, and in James's mind, it wasn't enough. Not yet. He bent down and grabbed the pile of lights, his fingers growing numb from the cold as he tried to untangle the knots that had somehow grown tighter since the last time he touched them. His frustration mounted with every pull, every loop that refused to come free. It felt as though the more he worked, the worse the mess became. Lily watched from the window, her heart heavy as she saw her father hunched over in the yard, trying to make the decorations perfect. She wanted to help, but more than that, she wanted to talk to him, to reach him somehow. She missed him, missed the man who used to spend hours laughing with her as they decorated the house, who always had time to listen to her stories, no matter how trivial. Now, he was always preoccupied, always on edge. With a deep breath, she slipped on her coat and boots, quietly stepping out into the cold. The snow crunched under her feet as she crossed the yard, her breath visible in the frosty air. She stopped a few feet away from her father, watching him struggle with the lights, his movements jerky and tense. For a moment, she hesitated. What could she say to make him understand? To make him see that it wasn't the lights or the decorations that mattered? "Dad," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. James didn't look up, his focus still on the tangled lights. "Yeah," he muttered, his frustration seeping through his tone. Lily took a deep breath and tried again, stepping a little closer. "Do we really need more lights? Everything looks fine. The house is already beautiful." James finally paused, glancing up at her, but his brow remained furrowed. "It's not just about the house looking nice, Lil," he said, sighing as he pulled another knot free. "I just want everything to be perfect this year. We've got the neighbors to think about, and the family coming over and—" "But Dad," Lily interrupted gently, "it already is perfect. It doesn't need more lights." He brushed her off, turning his attention back to the tangled mess in his hands. "I just want everything to be right for Christmas, Lily. You'll understand when you're older. It's important that things look good, especially when we have guests. You only get one chance to make the holiday special." Lily felt a pang of frustration rise in her chest. Why couldn't he see it? Why was he so focused on appearances, on making things perfect? Couldn't he tell that what she really wanted, what they all needed, was him? "Dad," she said again, her voice a little stronger now. "It's not the lights that make Christmas special." James shook his head, still not fully listening. "I know, but the lights are part of it, Lil. It's just one more thing I've got to finish." "No, it's not," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "It's not the lights, or the decorations, or any of this. I don't care about any of that." This time, her words cut through his focus, and James stopped what he was doing. Slowly, he looked up at his daughter, really seeing her for the first time that night. She stood there, her face flushed with cold, her eyes wide and filled with emotion. He could see something more than frustration in her expression, something deeper, something that made him pause. "I don't care about the lights," Lily said, her voice soft but firm. "I miss you, Dad. Can we just spend time together instead of worrying about all this?" Her words hung in the cold night air, lingering between them. For a moment, James didn't know what to say. He looked at her, at the sadness and longing in her eyes, and felt the weight of her words settle over him like the snow falling gently around them. He hadn't realized how distant he'd become, how consumed he was with making everything look perfect, when all his daughter wanted, when all his family needed, was for him to be present. James swallowed hard, suddenly feeling the exhaustion he'd been pushing down for weeks. He let out a long breath, dropping the tangled string of lights into the snow. The lights flickered briefly, then went dark, but for the first time, he didn't care. "Lily," he began, his voice quiet, almost hoarse. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize." She stepped closer, her eyes softening as she saw the change in him. I don't care about the lights, Dad. I just want to spend time with you, like we used to. James felt a lump form in his throat as he nodded, the stress of the holiday season suddenly seeming so small, so unimportant compared to the bond he had been neglecting. He looked at the house, the lights already glowing beautifully in the yard, and then back at his daughter, standing in the snow beside him. "You're right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been so wrapped up in all of this. I didn't see what really mattered." Lily smiled, her breath visible in the cold night air. "It's okay, Dad. We can still make it special." For the first time in weeks, James smiled back. A real smile. Not the forced one he'd been wearing through all the holiday preparations, but one that came from a place of relief, of understanding. He realized that Christmas didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be shared. He nodded, then reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder. "How about we finish these lights together? But this time, for us, not for anyone else." Lily grinned, her heart lifting. "I'd like that." Together, they bent down to pick up the tangled lights, the cold no longer biting, the stress of the season melting away. The lights didn't need to be perfect anymore. They just needed to be strung up with love. For the first time in weeks, James found himself standing still, his hands empty and his mind quiet. The tangled string of Christmas lights lay forgotten at his feet, half buried in the fresh snow that had begun to fall more heavily now, creating a thick, quiet blanket over the yard. The faint glow of the house lights illuminated the snowflakes, casting soft shadows across the backyard. James glanced up at the house. Wreaths on the doors, lights draped over every window, a beautifully decorated tree glowing warmly through the living room window. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But as he stood there, the weight of Lily's words still lingering in the cold air, James felt a pang of guilt settle deep in his chest. He had been so consumed with making Christmas perfect that he hadn't noticed how distant he had become. How had he let this happen? How had he allowed himself to become so fixated on the superficial details, missing what really mattered? His family, and especially his daughter, who had quietly slipped away from him without him even realizing it. James sighed, his breath visible in the frigid night air. He turned to look at Lily, standing beside him, her eyes watching him with a mixture of concern and hope. She had been brave to speak up, to say what she was feeling. And now, looking at her, James could see it clearly. He could see the distance that had grown between them, the quiet sadness in her eyes that he had missed. She didn't care about the lights, the decorations, or the perfect Christmas scene he had been trying so hard to create. She just wanted him. "You're right," James said, his voice soft but steady. He bent down, picking up the tangled lights, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I've been so caught up in making everything perfect that I forgot what Christmas is really about." Lily's face softened, her shoulders relaxing as she saw her father's expression change. "It's okay, Dad," she said, her voice gentle. "I just miss spending time with you. We don't need all this perfection. We just need you." James nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had been so worried about getting everything right, about making the holiday special for his family, that he had lost sight of what made it special in the first place. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet. I didn't realize how much I was missing. How about we finish the lights together? Not for the neighbors or for the guests, just for us. Lily smiled, her breath visible in the cold air. I'd like that. Together, they began to untangle the lights. But this time, there was no rush. There was no pressure to make everything perfect. The backyard was still, the only sound the soft crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional hum of a car passing by on the street. The world seemed to slow down, as if giving them space to breathe, to reconnect. They worked side by side, stringing the lights along the trees and bushes, weaving them through the snow-covered branches. Lily's fingers, numb from the cold, fumbled occasionally with the bulbs. But every time she dropped one or accidentally tangled the cord, James just laughed softly, shaking his head. No rush, he said with a smile. We've got all night. As they moved through the yard, the conversation came naturally, flowing in a way it hadn't in months. Lily talked about school, her friends, and the upcoming holiday break. James listened, really listened, his mind no longer cluttered with thoughts of work or unfinished tasks. He hadn't realized how much he had missed these simple moments with her, the easy way they used to talk, the way she used to share everything with him. I miss this, Lily said after a while, her voice soft as she draped a string of lights over a low-hanging branch. I miss spending time with you. It feels like we don't get to do this anymore. James paused, his hands stilling on the lights. The snow had begun to fall more heavily, and the glow from the house cast soft shadows across Lily's face. She looked older, more grown up than he remembered, and the realization hit him hard. He had been missing so much. I miss it too, he admitted, his voice quiet. I've been so focused on work and on trying to make everything perfect for Christmas that I forgot what was really important. I thought if I made everything look good, it would make up for not being there. Lily looked at him, her eyes wide with understanding. You don't have to make up for anything, Dad. We don't need a perfect Christmas. We just need you. James felt a knot in his chest loosen, a weight lift from his shoulders. He had been carrying around this pressure, this need to be the perfect father, to create the perfect holiday, to make up for the time he felt he had lost. But hearing Lily's words, seeing the look in her eyes, he realized that what she needed from him wasn't perfection. She needed his presence. I've been trying so hard to make everything special, James said, his voice heavy with the weight of his confession. I thought if I got the lights just right, if the house looked perfect, it would make up for all the things I've been missing. But I can see now that I've been missing the most important thing. You. Lily smiled, a soft, understanding smile that made James's heart swell with love. It's okay, Dad, she said. We don't need all the decorations to have a good Christmas. We just need to spend time together, like we used to. James nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep within him. He hadn't realized how much he had been chasing after perfection, thinking that it was the key to making the holidays special. But standing here, in the snow with his daughter, stringing up lights in the quiet night, he understood that it was never about the decorations. It was about the moments they shared, the time they spent together. They continued working, but now it felt different. There was no rush, no need to make everything look perfect. The lights weren't strung with precision. Some of them hung a little crooked, others flickered unexpectedly. but neither of them cared. They laughed when the string got tangled again, and James even let Lily take charge, giving her the freedom to place the lights wherever she wanted. As the snow fell more heavily, they took a step back to admire their work. The backyard wasn't perfectly decorated, but it glowed with a soft, warm light, the snow reflecting the colors of the bulbs. The house, the yard, and the trees all seemed to sparkle under the snow, but it wasn't the decorations that made the scene magical. It was the quiet joy of being together. "Looks pretty good," Lily said with a grin, wiping a few stray snowflakes from her hair. James smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they stood together, looking out over the softly glowing yard. "It looks perfect," he said, his voice filled with contentment. For the first time in weeks, James felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from crossing things off a to-do list or from getting everything just right. It was the kind of peace that came from knowing he was exactly where he needed to be, with his daughter, sharing a moment of quiet, simple joy. The lights flickered gently in the falling snow, and James felt the tension in his body melt away. As they stood there, shoulder to shoulder, watching the lights twinkle in the snow-covered yard, Lily leaned her head against her father's arm, feeling closer to him than she had in a long time. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the falling snow. James looked down at her, his heart swelling with love. "Thank you, Lily," he said softly, "for reminding me what really matters." They stood there for a long time, watching the lights glow softly under the blanket of snow. And for the first time in weeks, James felt like everything was exactly as it should be. Imperfect, but perfect in its own way. The air had grown colder as the night wore on, but neither James nor Lily seemed to notice. They sat together on the back porch, side by side, watching the lights they had just strung up twinkle softly in the snow-covered yard. The world around them was quiet, the only sound the gentle whisper of snowflakes falling from the dark sky. The glow of the Christmas lights cast a warm, almost magical light across the scene, but the true magic wasn't in the decorations. It was in the silence, the shared peace between father and daughter, the comfortable closeness they hadn't felt in so long. James wrapped his arm around Lily's shoulders, pulling her a little closer. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words right now. They were simply together, and that was enough. Lily leaned her head against her father's arm, letting out a contented sigh. The snow fell in soft sheets, layering the trees and bushes in a thick white blanket. The lights, imperfect as they were, twinkled through the snow, creating a scene that looked like something out of a storybook. But it wasn't the scene that made the night feel special. It was the feeling of having found each other again after weeks, maybe months, of drifting apart. James gazed out at the yard, the tension that had weighed so heavily on him for the past few weeks finally gone. He had spent so much time trying to make everything perfect, every light in place, every decoration meticulously arranged, and yet, here he was, sitting with his daughter in the most imperfectly decorated yard, feeling more at peace than he had in a long time. The realization came to him slowly, but deeply. It wasn't the lights, the gifts, or the decorations that made Christmas magical. It was moments like these, The quiet, simple moments of being with the people you love. Feels like Christmas now, doesn't it? James said softly, his voice low but filled with warmth. Lily nodded, smiling as she snuggled closer to him. Yeah, she whispered. It really does. They sat together in silence for a while longer, the twinkling lights casting soft shadows on the freshly fallen snow. In the glow of the lights, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They didn't need a perfect holiday. They didn't need perfectly placed lights or extravagant gifts to feel the magic of Christmas. They just needed each other.